My name's Andy, and I'd like to tell the story of Lady's Cave. And Lady's Cave is set on Hilbury Island, which you can see from Hoylake. Now, before I researched the story, I'd only been to Hilbury Island once, and that was in my early 20s, and with my brother Tim, my auntie Ruth, and two of our friends. We walked out in the morning as the tide was coming in. We stayed on the island for 5 or 6 hours, then walked off in the evening when the tide had gone out. And as we were walking off, we heard this music drifting over the sands. Didn't make sense to us because no one with a radio or anything. It was beautiful, like church, but very ethereal. So my auntie asked the guy walking on the sands, "What's that music we can hear?" He said, "Oh, that's the seals." The sounds of the seals have reached our ears. But Hilbury Island's got a long history. For the last 100 years or so, it's been a place where people can walk out to, and there's bird watching stations on there and boat stations. And in the 19th century, there's a telegraph station placed there, so the signal sent from Wales to Hilbury Island to Liverpool and let them know what ships were coming in. And in medieval times, it was owned by the monastery in Chester. And when the story starts, a monk is sent from St. Werburgh's in Chester to Hilbury Island. At first, he wasn't too sure whether he was going to like it or not, because he liked being in community. When he got to the island, he found he really liked it. He loved the island, and every day he'd walk around the island, get to know everything about it. He loved the special days when he heard the sounds of the seals singing coming across the shimmering sands. He loved standing on the island and watching all the shipping going up and down the River Dee. Many of them troop ships, because in those days they're always fighting the Welsh. And he loved the days after there'd been a storm, and he could taste the tang of the salt air on his tongue. And the story itself starts one day after there'd been a storm, and the monk was walking around the island in the morning when he heard a sound. He heard a sound he hadn't heard before. Now he knew all the sounds on the island, but this sounds like a human sound. That didn't make sense to him, because the tide had not long gone out. There wasn't any time for anybody to walk to the island. And this was like a woman sound, a groaning. But he knew exactly where the sound was coming from. It's coming from one of the caves on the island. So he made his way down the grassy slopes, down the sandstone cliffs, onto the rocky shore, and he carefully made his way along the slippery seaweed till he came into the cave. And there, lying on the cave on a shelf, was a lady. Now remember, this is medieval times. This was a lady. He could tell she's a lady by her hairstyle, some of the jewellery, and a long embroidered dress, which was wet and covered with bits of seaweed. But he put a hand over her mouth, and yes, she was still breathing. So he picked her up, carried her up onto the island, put her in one of the monk's cells, settled her down, took off some of her wet clothing, gave her some dry blankets to put on, stoked up the fire, and gave some nice, warm, nourishing soup. And after a while, her breathing became more easily, and colour came to her cheeks. So the monk said to her, "How come you ended up in the sea? Was it an accident or a foul deed?" And she said, "Neither. I threw myself into the sea." "You did what?" "That's right," she said. "I threw myself into the sea." And then she started to tell the monk her story. And she said, "Yes, I am a lady. My father is the Lord of Shotting Castle, and I loved growing up in that castle as a little girl. I loved standing on the battlements, looking out across the Cheshire Plains, watching the donkeys carrying the salt across over the River Dee and into the mountains of hills of Wales. I loved standing on the battlements and watching the River Dee wind its way to Chester. And she said, I loved my dad. I loved walking around the castle with him, going into the stables and smelling the sweet smell of the horses, going into the armoury, seeing the blacksmiths banging away on the swords they were making and fixing the armour. And she said, I loved sneaking off when my dad wasn't watching and going into the kitchens. And when she was young, the sergeant would let her have a go on the spit. But as she got older, she did admit she would flirt around with some of the servants because she was lonely. But then she told them a few months earlier, it all went wrong. It all went horribly wrong because her father called her into his room, dismissed all the servants and sat her down and said to her, I've got good news for you. You are going to marry a Welsh prince. But when she told him she couldn't, and the reason was she fell for one of the servant lads in the kitchen, he went mad. He went crazy. He went out of his mind. As soon as he found who that young man was, he sent him to one of the dangerous castles in North Wales, and she was put in the dungeon and the door was locked. And she told him she just sat in a corner of that cell and cried because she lost the man she loved, and the love for her dad, well, it had all went wrong. But after a while, she was let out of the dungeon and into the castle, and she was pleased because at least she was getting on with her dad again. And when a few days ago suggested you go for a sail on the estuary of the River Dee, she was pleased. She loved going sailing with her dad. And the previous day they're out on the River Dee. She told the monk she could see storm clouds brewing over Wales, but her father called her onto the deck of the ship and said to her, after he brought a letter out of his pocket, he said, I've got some sad news for you. Know that young man who went to the castle in North Wales? His letter says he's died. And the lady said, I went mad. I went crazy. I went out of my mind. All I knew, I didn't want to be on the ship anymore. And next thing you knew, I found myself on the bulwarks of the ship and I just threw myself into the sea. But she said, worse was to come, because the father came to the edge of the ship and shouted down to her, come back, come back. This letter's just a forgery. Come back, come back. You can marry whoever you like, whenever you like. And ropes got thrown to her, but try as she might, she couldn't reach the ropes. And the storm, the Brune and Wales arrived, blew the ship one way, and the tide and the currents pushed her the other way, and she ended up washed up in the cave. So now the monk knew her story and settled her down for the night. He went to sleep in one of the other cells, and in the morning he went to check on her. But this story is sad. It's a really sad story, because when he went to check on her, she died. Now some stories will tell you that he buried her on Hilbury Island, but we all know you can't do that to solid sandstone rock. So what I'll tell you is this: word got sent to Shotty Castle, and soon as her father heard, he made his way to West Kirby. The tide was out, and he made his sad way to Hilbury Island. There he identified his daughter's body. He waited for the tide to come in, sailed her back to Shotty Castle, where he buried her. And do you know, he mourned her. He mourned her every day until the day that he died. But meanwhile, back at Hilbury Island, I don't know about you, but I think the monk fell a little bit in love with her. He wanted their story to live on. He wanted people like me and you to tell a story. So he named the cave that he found it Lady's Cave. So if you're ever able to go to Hilbury Island, try and find the cave, and once you're in there, you can tell the story of Lady's